So we end up, we leave Greensboro 9:30 on a Saturday morning, October 28th, and I get motion sickness. And so my regimen for motion sickness is I take Dramamine, I make sure I don't eat anything greasy or big meal the night before, 24 hours before, and then when I'm on the planes, I don't eat. Well, I'm going to be flying for over 2 days, right? So this is a great plan, because who needs to eat over 2 days? And so that's what I did my plan. Now, I did eat on the planes. I had 2 pieces of chicken, about this big, and 2 meatballs, and then I had water and ginger ale, just to make sure that over these time period I wouldn't get sick. Because when I get to Liberia, there's going to be food, right? So we get in, it's Sunday evening, and it's 9:30 at night, and we're all tired, and it's dark outside, and we come into this airport that's about the size of this room. And it's been a while since it's had any cleaning or remodeling, and a lot of it's makeshift, and there's just people everywhere. Turns out they don't have the same security restrictions in Liberia as the United States, and so you can just come in and grab. And so I can tell you more about that experience walking to the hotel in the middle of the night, because the hotel didn't come pick us up later on. But so then that starts the journey. And so what do you hear when you go to Liberia? Number 1, don't drink the water. Drink the water, it's not going to go well with you. So you brush your teeth with bottled water, you drink bottled water, and bottled water is really expensive. So the other thing is, don't eat the meat. Okay, so how are you going to get your protein? They eat a lot of rice, they don't eat a lot of beans there. So you don't see a lot of bean meals, so you're not going to get a lot of protein from your beans. And then don't eat the fruit, don't eat the vegetables. Okay?
So what do you eat?
15 pounds later. And so you immediately find, like, okay, what am I going to eat? So there's bread. So that's pretty safe to eat. And they say if you can peel it, you can eat it. The other thing they say is if it's Lebanese, it's okay. So fortunately, we stayed at a Lebanese hotel. And so they were able to bring in food that was clean and that we could eat. But still, we had a heavy diet of French fries, of pizza, and of rice. And so over 14 days, we had rice, pizza, and French fries. And the pizza was it was pretty good. The French fries were all right, but that's how you lose 15 pounds in 2 weeks, because it takes a long time to be able to eat the food. So while it is rice, pizza, and French fries, it's a little bit different than what you would expect. And then it's so hot, you're sweating a lot. But that's the first time I'd ever experienced food insecurity, because it was really like, okay, now where are we going to be today? You better bring some bottles of water, and you're not going to get food, So like on the Tuesday before we left, we drove 4 hours out into the jungle to see the school where our kids went to school, and their father, before he passed away, he taught there. And so, it was like you're driving, and then I don't usually go to places where cell signal doesn't exist. I was like hours away from a cell tower, so I had a little bit of withdrawal. I think that's where some of the weight loss came from, really, is the anxiety of not having cell signal. But you see a people that don't depend on grocery stores. You see a people who forage literally off of the trees for coconuts, for mangoes, for bananas, and then to buy a thing of rice, a bag of rice, is almost a month's worth of work. So our driver, he got $10 a day to drive us from 6 in the morning till like 9 o'clock at night, and he would have to drive a whole week just to buy a small bag of rice to feed his family. So they experience food insecurity. That's the first time I'd ever experienced that. And as I thought about that, I thought about Luke 12. It says, "Therefore I tell you, don't be anxious about your life, what you eat or what you drink, nor about your body what you'll put on, for life is more than food. Consider the ravens, how they neither sow nor reap, nor they neither have a storehouse or a barn, and yet God feeds them. And so I really experienced God's sovereignty in a place where I had no ability to go anywhere on my own, to feed myself, and really thinking, okay, when I eat this, what's going to happen to me? You know, like, am I going to be okay after I take this bite of food? But every time, God was good. He was great. And it was just wonderful. So as we think about the conference today, we're going to spend a little bit of time this morning getting to know one another. And that's what we're calling the first course. It's going to be a 5-course meal today as we walk through the agenda. You do have a book in front of you. The book has the slides, so if you want to take notes on that, it's going to follow along with the slides, just like that. So we are going to spend time throwing our books on the ground. So we're going to spend a little bit of time getting to know one another. And then the second piece of the second course of the meal is going to be food in the Old Testament. Now, we're going to be focusing just on Genesis and Exodus because food is in almost every page of the Old Testament. So we don't have time. It would be a week-long conference to spend in the Old Testament with food. Then we're going to take a little bit of time and we're going to look at the books, the book of Luke and the meals in Luke. Because there's something interesting happening in the book of Luke about how Luke uses meals as mission for Jesus. And so in the book of Luke, Jesus is either coming from, going to, or eating a meal. And of the 24 chapters, over half of them have some reference to food or a large meal where Jesus is giving some type of teaching to the tax collectors, the Pharisees, the disciples around him. And he's using food to do that. And then we're going to do a break with hummus and pita bread. In light of hummus and pita bread, we're doing chocolate because that's always a good substitute for hummus. And then I couldn't figure out how to heat the pita, and I didn't want you to have cold pita. And then the fourth course is what it means to be on mission as a Christian in a church. And then the fifth is dessert in a doggy bag. So how do we take this away and how do we apply it? Because inevitably, the food transitions from something that nourishes us to something that drives us to obedience to God, to something that Jesus used to be on mission when he was here, to something that allows us to evangelize and to know others and to introduce them to Christ. So, any questions before we jump in this morning? All right. Well, this is free-flowing. Feel free to interrupt, talk, add your thoughts. One of the interesting things as I studied for this sermon series and for this conference is that the limited amount of scholarship on food is amazing. And that's actually, some of the folks have pointed out that the theology of food has been one of the areas, at least in the Old Testament, that's kind of a gap that people haven't spent a lot of time on. So we're forging new trails. We're trailblazers. And, we're glad we're...
That's because them old guys couldn't climb up in the trees.
That's right. Oh, man. Oh. So, as we get started this morning, one of the things that often helps, even as we know one another pretty well, is just to go a little bit deeper with that. And so, as you feel comfortable sharing, you can pick one question, you can answer them all in a couple minutes a piece of each other. But if we can start out with what we're calling an icebreaker. So this is an introduction, who you are, what made you maybe want to come to the conference this morning, what were you thinking you would get out of the conference today, and then a little bit about what dinner was like growing up for you. Did you guys have enough food? Did you eat together as a family? Did you ever experience a time of food insecurity? And then was there a time or a food or a period of the year that you just looked forward to? That drove you like, okay, I know I'm going to this place on this day and this is what I'm going to eat. Or did you build your life anyway around food? And so, just to give you an example, I'll go first. So, there were many times in the year where I really enjoyed eating. And Thanksgiving is probably my favorite holiday. But when we were growing up, we did the rounds. We were a divorced family, so we had to go to my grandmother's and my grandpa's and all of these places. But we got to eat each place we went. But what I remember is that on Thanksgiving, at least when we were younger, Thanksgiving is what brought everybody to my grandmother's. And so it was a time you got to see your extended family. There was food all over. My grandmother would make me a cherry cheesecake, which I loved. And so I would always look forward to getting up in the morning and then, okay, somebody's taking me to my grandmother's and Lori, my sister. And then my grandmother would say, I made your cherry cheesecake. And it's like, yes. And now my cousin Tim, he likes strawberry cheesecake. And so she would make him a strawberry cheesecake. And I was always wondering, like, is there a cherry one in there? But there was. And so she had thought about me. And she had made that effort because she knew I liked the cherry cheesecakes. But food wasn't always, abundant in our family. And when my mom and dad divorced, I can remember, I don't know if Lori remembers this, and this may not even be a true memory as much as I remember, but I can remember times when there would be like a pot and a can of pinto beans, and that's what we had, the Lux pinto beans, the yellow can. That's what we had for dinner. I remember one time vividly, like, getting seconds and maybe mom not getting seconds. And I don't know, my whole mind around that memory isn't always clear, but just that idea of the sacrificial way that mom used food and then the enjoyment of the abundance of food on Thanksgiving. Let's start with Gordon. We'll go around the tables, and if you want to share who you are and what your thoughts are.
I'm Gordon. We ate together as a family. We ate typical Hungarian fare, a lot of meat and potatoes, noodles. We always had enough food. There were times when we had other people than family, and going to my grandfather's for special occasions where there was always a lot of Hungarian bakery, which is delicious. I remember that.
What generation are you? I mean, in America?
Third.
Okay.
They all came from Hungary.
Interesting.
Little short, swarthy people.
Short, swarthy people. Generation hungry.
I'm Kathy. We did eat together growing up as a family. Typical family food. When I was growing up, there was always a meat and a starch and a vegetable.
Yeah.
So yeah, my mother tried to do all of that. Some things were more successful than others, but typically we had enough. My mom was not social at all. She didn't like other people. She very liked me. So we didn't have anybody come over to the house. But probably Christmas was the most enjoyable event that I look forward to in terms of food, just because all the family and all the cousins got together, and it was, food and family.
That's awesome. Mary?
Yeah. We did eat together as a family. My mother was very similar, and I had to clean my plate, which I don't think my children do. But we always had enough. I can't remember ever having people into our home for dinner much. I mean, until I got to high school and we started having friends over, then my parents became more social. But one thing my mother always did was Sunday lunch was always an important meal. That was like the most important meal of the week, whether she was cooking or whether we went out to eat. She would tell that her mother, that was an important time, and it was always, because you never knew who was going to stop by. You always cooked more, because someone may come by and visit. That had been lost, like, by the time, my mother was doing that, but still the structure of a Sunday dinner was still there. Who did I look most forward to? I don't know. I guess family, big family gatherings.
Yeah.
so,
We did not eat together as a family.
Sorry, what's your name?
Oh, hi, I'm Gary. Gary Michael McGee Jr. Fourth generation Irish. Thankfully, we did not get served Irish food. Fish and chips is about the only thing I think the Irish serve that tastes worth anything, or has any taste. But we did not eat together as a family. As I saw this when we were talking yesterday and looking at the format. Meals in my house were reflective of the nature of my family, which I think can be true for everybody, but it was reflective of the brokenness or the breakdown of my family. What I remember of meals is a lot of fast food, a lot of TV dinners, if you remember those with the cellophane and and a lot of that was because what I remember especially of my teenage years was getting something to eat, fixing our own stuff. I would go to my bedroom and eat and watch television. My little brother would go to his bedroom and eat and watch television. My dad would go downstairs, sit in the recliner and watch television and eat. My mom would go to her bedroom and watch television and eat. And so that was family meals for me growing up. I got a different glimpse because my parents were divorced early on. A few times a year I got to spend time with my dad's stepmom's family, and they did sit around the table and eat, so it gave me a glimpse of what I wanted. But that didn't happen in the family I really grew up in. Foods we typically ate, a lot of fast food. Sadly, when I look at the last question, the things I think, what did I look most forward to and why, was Arby's.
Arby's.
I mean, it's sad, and at the same time, that's what comes up for me. It's like an Arby's roast beef and a Jamocha shake. Sadly, now I'm lactose intolerant, so I can't look forward to the Jamocha shakes anymore. But we always had enough food. It was lame food, but we had plenty of it. Ate Little Debbie's for breakfast and drank a Coke.
There you go.
Yes, so that was very healthy. Were there times? No, I don't ever remember hosting anybody else at my family. I don't think we wanted people to see what our family was really like. So.
Yeah. Speaking of Coke for breakfast, one of our professors at Gordon Conwell, Jeffrey Niehaus, he's a unique individual, but he does 2 Cokes for breakfast with the class, and he uses the first one to gargle with before we sing our first hymn. So at Gordon Conwell, we do worship before class, and so the teacher will put a hymn up, a Mighty Fortress or something like that. And so you have this guy, he's about 70, takes his Coke, pours it back, gargles it, and then, okay, now he's ready to sing a Mighty Fortress. I'm going to offer that to Andrew before he starts worship, because I think it really adds something. And we thought it was just kind of like, this is the one, nope, every morning before we start talking about Old Testament theology, okay, we're going to gargle some Coke. Yeah, so if he'd had a Little Debbie's, he'd have been right there with you.
There you go. No cream pies. I look forward to those too.
Oh, man. We couldn't have all Little Debbie's because one of them had devil in the name. So we were Christian with them. Lori?
Okay, my name's Lori, and did we eat together as a family? In the early years, yes, my dad and my brother and myself. My mom worked second shift, so we didn't see her a lot. Foods did we typically eat? During the summertime, we would sit around until late at night. Eric probably don't remember because he was much younger. But we would sit around at my great aunt's house, which is right next door, and we would break beans and sit up by the moonlight, and the old folks sharing stories and things like that. So we ate well in those times, and then after my parents divorced, it was probably the reason that my brother had pinto beans was probably because I was the cook. So a lot of times,
Confession.
it's stuff that I had to figure out how to do. But so there were times when I would notice that my mom would hunt, sometimes after they were divorced. Immediate family never ate with us. I can't recall any of that. Our cousins live 2 doors down, so sometimes they may be at the house, but other than that, no. And food I look forward to was Thanksgiving for the same reasons, because my grandmother she had a spread and everyone was welcome. My grandmother has this saying that just because someone's divorced or separated or whatever, I still love them. It didn't affect me and my love for them. So at Christmas or Thanksgiving, I mean, there would be ex-spouses coming by or, you know, just whoever, because, you know, her home was just, if I love you, it doesn't affect, you know, just because you can't live with someone else doesn't affect my love for you. So
Wow.
it was a nice time to have everybody together.
Yeah, that didn't make it awkward at all.
No.
I mean, so it was kind of a shield against divorce, because you know they're still going to be at grandma's. When you go there, you're still having Thanksgiving together, whether you're divorced or not. And yeah, it is hearing Lori say that, you know, my grandmother still to this day makes a meal every day. And for a long period of time, she had people from the city coming, or family coming, like the fire chief came for years and eat at her house on every day at noon. And then all of her grandkids would come, and she'd make like a 5-course meal every day. And she's, what is she, 80 now, roughly? And she still gets up every morning before my dad goes to work and makes him breakfast. He has to be there like at 5:30 or 6, so she gets up at 4, makes him eggs and a whole spread. And yeah, I know, right?
I fall so short with my
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Paul?
Yeah. Let's see, did we, oh yeah, we ate together as a family. If you wanted food, you ate together at the table with the family. That was the rule, and it was that way throughout my childhood. I don't remember any time that wasn't the case. Kind of our rule. Typically, we mostly, well, when I was really young, we had gardens, and so we raised a lot of vegetables. We canned a lot of food. We did that sort of thing. So we ate a lot of vegetables, which carries over to today. For me, may or may not have meat. That was something that was kind of a luxury. But I mean, we do. Anyway, that's kind of what we ate. Always had enough food. I can't remember ever. It may not be what we wanted, you know, but we always had food. No doubt about that. Other people, other than family, no. Now, we did have Thanksgiving. Most people say Thanksgiving was the time that you always remembered, because it's almost like that's what Mom lived for the whole year. It was for Thanksgiving, and we have, you know, we may have 40 or 50 people at the house, all family, you know, which I love. That's one of the things I always loved, and luckily my sister carries that over to Christmas now. My sister does that on Christmas Day now, and all the family comes, and you know, I really appreciate her doing that. What food did you look at? Anything other than vegetables. I mean, really, I just, you know, we would, you know, Mom might make a pizza or something like that, you know, just for some fun food on occasion, which we look forward to. But anyway, fortunately, you know, I hear a lot of people growing up in broken homes, and that's got to be tough, you know, and I didn't have to deal with that. I'm really fortunate and glad of that. But the meal was an important thing. The meal was always an important thing to us.
Yeah, Paul and Brenda came over last night and brought spaghetti and 7-layer salad. And one, it was amazing, so thank you guys. But two, just the idea of people bringing food to our home has been amazing. I never really understood what Take Them a Meal did for people until I've experienced it. You know, we've always taken meals and things like that, but just, wait a minute, you mean someone's bringing hot food and we're just going to sit and it's been such a blessing to experience that, and just kind of that hospitality, almost like a reverse hospitality, rather than inviting people in to eat and bringing food over. It's made it wonderful. So, and Brenda tried a new recipe. She should keep it. Baked spaghetti was wonderful. And so it's just been, I don't know, food's been like a month thing for me.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you guys, but some people eat to live, some people live to eat. I'm an eat to live kind of guy. If God would have made us not having to eat, I'd have been okay with that. You know, if we just had little pods we, you know, put in and that kept us going kind of thing. But some of you may live to eat.
Well, it was interesting, the last question about what food you look most forward to in life, and the times that growing up, I struggled with an eating disorder in high school and college. I mean, even after I was a normal weight, I was still very messed up in here about fear around food, right? So, I mean, I think about your children and food insecurity, and I'm going, you know, here I was in Atlanta planning, and I was in bondage in my mind around food, so.
Well, when I got to Liberia, that might be my theme for a minute, Liberia, because it's so fresh. They looked like they were feeding our children out of dog bowls.
Dog
bowls. So have you seen those stainless steel bowls
Yeah,
that you feed your dog in? That's what they fed them in. Now they were bowls to them, they weren't dog bowls because they didn't feed dogs in Liberia. Dogs, they had dogs, but they were very skinny and frail, and they just kind of foraged. But you know, when they came over, they got their scoop of rice and whatever part of fish was left, whether it was the bone, the head, the tail, and that's what was in there. And then they covered it with some spice. And then you came up, and it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen some of those commercials where they want you to adopt a child for $19 a month, and they're standing there in a sad child, and they're digging with their hands in the bowl. That was real, you know, and that's like, and they were thankful. And I'll share more about their level of thankfulness as we go, but it's so hard to watch. Like, well, I feed Ellie out of a bowl like that. My children, these other 13 kids in this home, are eating out of what I would give a dog. And we're happy. Oh, okay.
Yes, we ate together as a family. That was just, I think, the norm maybe back then. Foods you typically ate, I think it was the meat, potatoes, bread and butter kind of thing. My mom was a bread baker, so we always had, in fact, store-bought bread was a treat for me because it's like, really? And did you always have enough food? Yes, always had plenty. Lived on a farm also, so, you know, yes, we even had meat because I remember, you know, cutting off the heads of the chickens.
Was this in
and-
Michigan?
Michigan.
Yeah, so you ate with your finger. Gordon, don't get me off track. And yes, raised gardens and always, you know, moms and grandmas did a lot of canning and that kind of thing. Other people, you know, not so much, and I don't know, maybe it was the era in which we grew up where you didn't have other people in so much other than family. I do remember Sunday dinners were always important, and sometimes we would go to another cousin's house for family dinner, and her mom may have them in. Now, my mom died when she was pretty young, 48, so the last couple of years of high school, I was the cook, and it probably suffered a little bit there, but, you know, we got through.
She learned well.
So, but, you know, I didn't have any issues, or, you know, we always had food. It was abundant and whatever we wanted. Yeah, I really enjoy eating, so, you know, I like food. Certainly try to be more healthy than I used to be, but what food did you look most forward to? You know, my mom was a really good cook, although because she died so young, it's hard for me to reflect back on what was my favorite thing that she might have fixed for us. But I do remember Ken's mom fixing one of my favorite things.
Steal my story.
I'm just going to steal this one because she made the best fried chicken. So when Jake was born, when our firstborn, she brought over a meal of her fried chicken, her potato salad, and it was the first time I really ever liked potato salad, was Ken's mom's, and fresh sliced tomatoes. And it was like the best meal that I still remember. It's like, oh, it was so good. Now, some of that might have been, you know, after giving birth and all that kind of stuff, but, so, yeah, I have good memories of all that.
Yeah. So fried chicken, potato salad, and sliced tomatoes.
Mhm.
You guys are in Michigan still, right?
Michigan.
That sounds just like North Carolina.
Doesn't
I was like, oh, you guys think that's some southern fare.
Well, I've just been hearing about, when I went to the dentist, about snow cream. And it's like, really, you would think we in the north would be experts on snow cream, and I'd never heard of it.
Really?
So now I know, now I'm hearing about
Ah.
snow cream.
It's
Second
good.
snow, not the first. The
That's
first one
what I
cleans the air,
And don't eat the yellow snow.
and the yellow snow is.
Whatever.
Yeah, you guys had manna falling from the sky all that time, and you had no idea.
That's probably true.
Feet and feet of manna.
Yeah, that's why we go get bread and bread and milk every time it snows. We have to make our snow cream.
Yeah, yeah, the jobs are there.
Yeah, or milk sandwiches. I never really understood that either. And Diane?
Oh, I was hoping I'd go last, but that's
Okay.
okay. No, it's fine. So I feel like I'm like totally different from everybody else, but I feel like I picked on most like of Gary's story. Not picked on, but like picked out a lot of what he said. So we did not eat together as a family in my house. So I'm the oldest of four, and my mom went back to school when I was younger, so that put a lot of basically like mom on me. So what I remember of meals before she started back to school was they were very broken. We would eat in shifts. It was, if you're here and the food is hot and you want to eat, eat. If not, you can eat when we get back from wherever it is that we've got to run to. Soccer practice, football, we'll come back, eat, go back. Anyways. So I don't really remember eating a lot together as a family. In fact, my dad typically made his plate and then went to the bedroom, which really irritated my mom. So, I mean, we would do kind of a lot of fast foods because we were just on the go constantly. We would do a lot of box meals like Hamburger Helper, anything fast that we could just get together in like less than 30 minutes and kid friendly, of course. So that was kind of just what we ate, not very healthy. But I mean, we always had enough from what I can remember. There was always food. It's just, did you want to eat it? If not, you made yourself something else. But I feel like I have this love-hate relationship with food because this one memory sticks out to me, so I'll get to that. But when I was younger, I lived in Charlotte with my grandparents. So a little bit of extra background. I don't know who my dad is. The dad that I call dad is my stepdad. So in that transition time from my dad to what I call dad, I lived with my grandparents, and those were sit-down meals. Those were, we ate together as a family. And then when we moved to Georgia, that's when everything kind of changed. But I remember vaguely this one memory of, I had to have been second or third grade, but I had finished everything on my plate except for my chicken. And they wouldn't let me up from the table until I ate it. And I probably sat there for a couple hours because I was like, I'm not hungry, like I can't eat it. And you talked about like not making your kids eat food. And I was forced to eat everything that was on my plate. And I remember not eating it, and I got beat to the point that I got bruised by my dad because I didn't eat it. So much to the fact that they were worried I couldn't lay on my back because my bottom was that black and blue. So they didn't want me to go to school the next day, because they didn't want me to say anything. So again, I don't make my children eat everything either because I just want them to eat. They'll eat when they're hungry is kind of my thing. Anyways, but that's always stuck out to me. When we moved again later, I was, kind of in charge of making the meals. Always had to make my dad sandwiches, mayo on one side, mustard on the other, turkey, cheese, that was his thing. I had to make. So to me, food was just a chore. I didn't enjoy food. And so it was just, I did it because I had to, but it wasn't something that I really enjoyed. So I guess, we didn't ever have people come over. I remember in high school when I played soccer, they did, the night before, we had a big game at home, we would do like an Italian meal at somebody's house. And I never volunteered because I knew that, you know, my mom, it meant she was going to have to make it. It was going to be more work on her, you know, more money that was going to need to be spent, that sort of thing. So I never volunteered us, even though, like, I got to the point where I was a senior and people were like, oh, we're not going to do it at your house. I was like, no, you know, and we'll just go to somebody else's house type thing. So I just tried to play that off. But yeah, we never really had anybody come over. Even for Thanksgiving, we stayed in Georgia, and most of our family's here in North Carolina. And, I mean, for Christmas, we did travel. I guess we would come up to Raleigh and visit, like, my grandparents, or go to Charlotte and visit my other set. But I guess that would be the meal I would look forward to most, just because it meant, like, I could get out of the house and go see other family and stuff. But yeah, I guess I kind of like you. I don't know that I officially, like, I had an eating disorder, but, like, I've always struggled. I feel like today, even still, like, I struggle with it. And my grandfather would give me, my dad's dad, of course, but he would give me a really hard time about eating and my weight. At one point, he would tell me, like, I was overweight and I needed to watch it because my mom struggles with she's bad knees. And so, you know, now I'm kind of seeing some similar things with my knees, and he's like, oh, you know, it's all in what you eat. Your knees are having to support your body. And so he would get on me for that. And so I remember specifically after he did that, I dropped weight really fast. Just because I was very concerned, you know, about my image and what I looked like and whatnot. But so I don't really have, like, a positive conception of food, I guess.
Yeah.
And when I'm in an environment that I don't feel comfortable in and food is present, like, I feel like sometimes I just eat because I'm like, you know, it gets me away from what I feel uncomfortable with, and then I feel terrible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, not super positive, but
Yeah. Thank you
At
for
least-
sharing that.
thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Ken?
We can end on a better note now.
I don't know. Come on, Ken.
We just about heard my story when Kay told hers. It was about the same thing. We're both country kids. We didn't live close together, but I was.
I thought you were cousins.
Typical might not be real good there.
But my family always ate together. If we were home, we would eat at the table as a family. We always returned thanks. I remember that. I remember my dad was always the one to return thanks, and that was nobody ate anything until he returned thanks.
Yeah.
And the types of foods was meat, potatoes. What was the saying?
Your mom would look, meat, potatoes, bread, and butter. Okay,
Yep,
there's
and
that.
we're good.
It really wasn't always that true, but.
But it was, and we always had enough food. We were in the country, raised on a farm. Even though my dad was not a farmer, as you know, farmers. He was a beekeeper, but all the friends, everybody's friends were farmers, and so we always had fresh food to eat. We always had a big garden. Dad was quite a gardener. So there was always plenty to eat. Let's see, because our family, my family was on both sides, my mom and my dad's side, were not, their siblings were not local, so we didn't meet together as an extended family. But pretty much every Sunday, or quite often on Sunday, we would be going to someone else's house to eat dinner, Sunday dinner, or they would come to our house. So it was always a time to look forward to, because most of the, back then, when baby boomers, every family had lots of kids, so all the kids would get together and have a good time. Food that I look most forward to is, again, my mother's fried chicken.
Oh, yeah.
And
Not
potato
just-
salad.
I'm surprised you're not gonna say your third generation Czech grandma's kolaches or something.
Yes. Gordon, you're Hungarian, I'm Czech. And my grandmother,
So you have a bunch of brunja in your family.
Grunge.
That's a Czech word which is not favorably used for what your family
Remember,
may be.
short and swarthy.
okay. But yes, she made kolache. But that was very seldom that, as a kid, that we would get to,
Ken, I know that because my first wife's family was Czech.
Oh,
that's not-
And I learned that word.
Is that what you
Nothing
became?
against the Czechs,
I'm
right?
sure I became the Brunger.
He heard that word a lot.
Term of endearment.
Fair enough. You can say that, yeah.
What is kolache? Or how do you say-
it's a
Pastry.
pastry, but it's a very tough dough. I would say it was tough dough, and it was fried,
No.
baked. It tasted like it was fried, but it was baked, and it would always have a dab of some kind of fruit in the center.
And quite often
Apricot.
prune or something, or apricot, or,
The southern version is fried.
so that's
Fried kolache.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Like a fried pie.
Let's see.
Ken's probably like you, though. I think now I think he's changed over these years, but when I first met him, he would eat to live. So food wasn't that big a deal for
Yeah.
Ken.
Let's see, that's about it. Always look forward to holidays because my mom's mom lived in the same little burg that I was from. She was a good cook. And so her other kids, or one of her other kids, would come up from the Victoria area and we'd have a big Thanksgiving meal or Christmas meal to kind of carry it on to our family. So lots of good food. Never had to worry about eating. I mean, it was never a thought. We would not have something to eat.
Did you eat nedlicky?
Pardon
Did you eat nedlicky?
me? No.
It's like a bread dumpling.
No.
We had some nedlicky this week. Heidi Strickland brought us some German bread dumplings. So I don't know if they call it, I don't know exactly what she called it, but yeah, it was very good.
Eric, when you were in Liberia, over that 2-week period then, did you feel hungry? Like, did you ever have that sensation? Like, wow, I am so hungry.
You know what, like, so the number of prayers that were answered in Liberia were, it was just amazing how many things that we went through, that the only thing that we could do was pray and then see God move. And there was day after day where that happened. So just a quick aside, Tuesday of the second week, the U.S. Embassy called the adoption agency and said their fingerprints have expired and they can't adopt. You have to do that stateside. So, yeah, so we've been there for like almost a week and a half, and our fingerprints expired on 11/4, and it was 11/6, and the visa was going to be issued on 11/7. And she said the fingerprints have to be good all the way through the visa process. Well, Hannah had interpreted that as our fingerprints for our visa to go to Liberia, which we were good, but no, was our fingerprints good for our kids' visas, which would be issued the next day. So we were 3 days expired. And so we sent out messages for everybody to pray, and it was like 2 hours that she had called back and said, I'm sorry for the delay, 11/4 is fine, and she processed the visa. Things like that happen almost every day. And like I said, we could call this Liberian Faith Conference. That'll be the next one. From arriving in Liberia and having spent the last 37 years of my life talking about what it means to have faith in Jesus and God and His sovereignty, to having to have faith, two different things. It's humbling, and you'll figure out really quick if you have faith or not. And I spent a lot of time the first couple of days repenting of my lack of faith. But the reason I say all of that is to say this. There was never a time where I felt hungry. The whole time. It was amazing. Hannah would look at me, are you hungry? I said, no, I'm not. You know, I haven't had a lot to eat. I mean, the day we went out to the bush, we left at 7 o'clock that morning, drove 4 hours, spent about an hour and a half out there, drove 4 hours back. I had 3 sips of water.
Huh.
I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thirsty. It was a phenomenal move of the Spirit and a building time in my life. Now, I'm ready for swimsuit season, but coming into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I'm going to make up for all of that. But no, I never felt hungry, and it was just, yeah, phenomenal.
Well, you're really saying it was a God-given gift that didn't happen.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
lack of food they had, yeah.
Yeah, because if you, like, for the first, well, from Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, to Monday night, so 4 days, I had 2 pieces of chicken, 2 meatballs, bottle of water, and then a little bit of rice that Monday evening. Yeah, it was, you know, and I had spent some time in Luke, and that's what I've been reading, and don't worry about your food, and God kept bringing me back to that, and there was a reason. He was saying, I got you. And then I started hearing there's food that you don't know of that I have. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by the word. And then those things became very real to me. And the prayer became, Lord, nourish me, refresh me. And I can remember sitting in the back of this Toyota 4Runner with 5 adults beside me, me turned sideways, then Hannah, then Ashley, then Michelle, then Rose, then Romeo, Ruth, and Kuta, and Benita, and praying a prayer of refreshment and not being hot. 85 degrees, Africa, windows rolled up, air conditioning in the front of the car, and I'm comfortable. I can't explain it. It's a God thing. But no, I appreciate the question. But as you go around the room and we hear about different stories of food, we hear stories of togetherness, we hear stories of brokenness, we hear stories of loving food, we hear stories of really being turned against food, or food being used as a vice, or food being a way of trapping us. And that's just the people in this room. As you walk outside these doors, everyone has a story about food. Everyone has either a good story or a bad story. They lack security in food. And we're called to enter into those lives and to bring them not only bread and water of nourishment, but the bread and water of the gospel. And so what we'll see as we go forward today is that that's what Jesus did. He went and he had meals with them, the outcast, the traitor. And it was a meal of a mission bringing them into the kingdom. Because just like it says in Luke 15, that when one would enter the kingdom, he would throw a party, he would kill the fatted calf. And that's what he wants for all of us. And that's why in Matthew 28, when he says to go, that's what and we're in a situation we're going to learn later on. We're in a post-Christian Western world, and we're going to discuss whether we believe that or not. But they were in a pre-Christian ancient Near East, and the message was to go. And that's our message today. Our message is that we must go. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing. Let's take about a 10-minute breather, refresh your coffee, and the next course will be food in the Old Testament. So cleanse your palates and
Awesome.
Ready for the next course. All right. So one of the things that we're going to talk about this morning is evangelism and being on mission. And being on mission, one of the components of being on mission is that we're talking about the whole story of God. And we see the Bible as one unified story, as God's big rescue plan, as we move from Genesis 3 in the fall, all the way through to Revelation when everything is settled and we're in heaven. One of the things that Ethan asked me just this week, when he loves to eat, and he'll eat until there's no food left, even if he's not hungry. And so after about 3 plates of lasagna, I told him he couldn't have any more.
Who was that?
Ethan, my oldest. He's 10. And so he proceeds to ask me this question. Dad, in heaven, can I eat all I want? All right? And so, what do you say to that, right? So I said, son, in heaven, you won't have to worry about eating all you want, because in heaven you will eat and you will be satisfied. And so this idea that food will also be reconciled in heaven. And we're going to talk about food in the Old Testament. We're going to see how food, something that is good and pleasant to the sight and is satisfying after the fall, becomes something associated with death. So, as we talk about food in the Old Testament, like I said earlier, it's almost every page there's something about food. Food was critically important to the ancient Near East. They often had too little, they often were in famine, and what they did have was in season, right? So if you had the olives in season, you had the fruits that are in season, the fig. You know, if you remember Jesus walking and he's looking and he sees the fig tree and it's time for the season, and he goes up and it doesn't bear any fruit, and he curses that tree. You know, it was seasonal. And they have big dining room tables. They often sit around a mat on their knees or reclining. And this is a picture of the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, with the beloved laying on Jesus' breast. That's kind of what it would be like. They were sitting down and eating, and they would, you know, it wasn't like the movie I watched about Jesus where he was a carpenter and he was building tables and he, you know, selling them. Everybody had the 8-piece dining room set and they had the carved wooden bowls. It was a little bit different than that. And food was communion. Food was communal. And interestingly enough, when the rich would eat, they would open the doors and let the poor watch them eat. You know, if you think about that today, like, can you imagine having a feast, putting it out in the middle of Winston, East Winston, and having all the rich come and eat, and just have the poor stand around and watch? So you can have that in mind as we get to the book of Luke. And today's focus is only in Genesis and Exodus, because that's really all we have time for in the 12 hours we're going to be here. 4. So when we think about Genesis and the first mention of food in the Bible, you don't have to go very far. Genesis 2:9, it says this: "And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food." And remember, just hold that in, pleasant to the sight and good for food, in your mind. The tree of life that was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then, 7 verses later, Genesis 2:16, we read this: "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it, you shall die." So, when we think about this, why do you think God would create food that is good and pleasant to our sight and good to eat, and then immediately 7 verses later command us not to eat the food?
Well, it wasn't all the food he said not to eat. It was just food from a particular tree.
That's right. And that's exactly what the serpent will tell them. Didn't God command you not to eat of the food? That's the exact thing that will come up in the fall a little bit later. There was one tree that they were commanded not to eat of. So what does that help us understand around food and obedience to God?
Well, it seems like God's presenting man with a choice. Because nothing else was forbidden except the one thing.
Yeah.
So I don't, the relationship, I don't know.
Yeah, I just found it interesting, and that's why the question's here. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer specifically. I just found it interesting that God chose food as the way that we would obey Him.
Or disobey him.
Or disobey Him.
No.
Why a tree in the garden? Why food? And as we think about culture today, what do you think he would choose in our culture?
Your cell phone.
Our cell phone. Yeah. You may do everything except have a cell phone. Oh man, the fall just happened again. Yeah.
It's God's emphasizing provision and trust, and then when the enemy comes along, he emphasizes the lack.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
because there's plenty of other things they could have eaten from.
Right.
That's what I kept thinking. There were plenty of other options.
That's right. Like it wasn't like there was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then the other tree that wasn't as pleasant to look at, and that was the tree
Right.
they had to choose from, and you were like standing between them, like, do I want that kind of scribbly prune, or do I want the, this nice apple? But it was this idea that God had provided something that was satisfying, and then what you withhold and understand His provision from this one tree. Fascinating as I started to go through that, which brings us into Genesis 3, 6, and 19. And we see something very similar to Genesis 2:9. We see, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, if you remember Genesis 2:9, He made every tree to sprout up that was good and pleasant to sight. And the tree was to be desired to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate, and gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So, now we obviously don't know how much time passed between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. They could have been in the garden for years, thousands of years, because they weren't going to die. They didn't age. Death had not entered into the picture. We don't know how long it took. But immediately after, we see the symbolism of God who says that food is good and pleasant to the sight and that you should take part, except. And then we see the woman, in this instance, looking at the tree and saying the exact same words as the Creator, and then seeking to become the Creator, seeking to become God, takes and eats of that and gives to her husband. And so then we move to Genesis 3:19, and we see, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat. So then food is cursed. So we start out with food as good and pleasant to the sight. It's satisfying. Food becomes a way to show our obedience to God and understanding His provision and being in communion with Him. And then food becomes a curse. And now to get food, you will do it by working and tilling the ground. And as you think about all the stories we have in here, some good, some pleasant, some we wish we could forget, the lack of food, the abundance of food, it becomes about provision. And so I would be remiss if I didn't do a brief Hebrew lesson for you guys today. So in Genesis 2:9.
It's okay if you're remiss.
I am not going to be that. In Genesis 2:9, the word used for food is ma'akal. Okay? That is the food in that verse in Hebrew that is good and pleasant to the sight. Ma'akal. And you read Hebrew from left to right.
Right to left.
Right to left. My right, your left.
Yes.
Okay. So ma'akal, reading in this direction. But interestingly, in Genesis 3:19, it changes from ma'akal to lakem. Okay? That word is typically associated with bread. So you have the food from God that is good and pleasant to eat, that's ma'akal. It's provided by Him. And then in 3:19, there's something different that occurs. Now it's lakem. It's food you have to work for. It's food by the sweat of your brow. And as we think about those two words, some scholars have gone through the Old Testament and looked at the occurrences of ma'akal and lakem and have noticed some things about that. So ma'akal, Genesis 2:9, food, is food that is provided by God with no work required by man. No sweat of your brow. It's satisfying. It's provided for you. Where lakem is food you have to work for, Genesis 3:19. Ma'akal is associated with life. It's life-giving. Let's remove them from the garden, lest they eat of the ma'akal and live forever. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat lechem. Provided by God. Work. The provision of the lechem, the bread, is still by God, but now you're going to get it by tilling the soil. One is life, one is death. Now, I did a quick word study on both of these, and it holds up about 80% of the time around the scholarship around Ma'akal and lechem. So I think their argument that one is totally provided by God with no work is okay. It's not exactly a 100% science as much as we would like it to be, but it's close. And interestingly enough, when you get to Exodus, what they're eating off the ground, the manna, is lechem. It's not ma'akal. And it's provided by God, but you still have to go out and gather it. And so there's still work that has to be done there, and so lechem is used. Which is interesting. Have you guys ever heard of Bethlehem? Maybe once or twice you've heard of Bethlehem.
Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. That's exactly right. Christmas, yeah. Somebody we know might have been born there once or twice. We've heard of it in church. But Bethlehem is a compound word of bet, which means house, and lechem, which means bread. And so Bethlehem is the house of bread. And so as you keep that in your mind as we go through and we talk about the breaking of the bread, Jesus on the cross and how he was broken, Jesus came from Bethlehem, the house of bread. So that's our as we think through that. And so we think about moving forward now to the story of Joseph. And so one of the and we're skipping quite a bit, right, of Genesis, and there's a lot of food in between there. There's Noah and how he commanded and all of what he should eat on the boat. But for the sake of time, we jump to the story of Joseph, because God is going to use famine, the lack of food, to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham in Genesis 15:13. He says to him this. It said, the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So if you know the story of Joseph, Joseph is the overconfident youngest son of Jacob. Jacob and Rachel. If you know how Jacob had many wives and how that came about, but Joseph was his favorite son. This is the coat of many colors. This is the dreams that his older brothers were going to bow down to him. And so just like all good brothers would do, they found a way to sell him into slavery. If you're gonna be that obnoxious, we think you should go to Egypt. And so they do. They sell him into slavery. And that was good, because the other idea was to leave him in the pit and have him torn up by animals. So I don't know, between the two, but he was sold into slavery. But his imprisonment through Potiphar's wife will lead him to be the second most powerful man in Egypt, aside from Pharaoh. And so what's going to happen is he's going to end up in prison. And as he's in prison, he's going to meet a cupbearer and a baker, wine and bread. And he's going to be asked to interpret a dream for the king, the Pharaoh, and that's going to elevate him to the status of second most powerful other than Pharaoh. And so when we think about that, his elevation, interpreting the dream of the 7 skinny calves and the 7 fat calves, of the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, is what brings the entire people of Israel in the book of Exodus into Egypt. So what's going to happen is Joseph is going to rise to power. He's going to be a shrewd businessman, and he's going to go around and he's going to make storehouses of grain. And as he makes his storehouses of grain, he is going to be able to sell that in the years of famine, the 7 years of famine. And so people are going to come around from all around Egypt and give what they have just to get grain. Well, turns out that the rest of the folks that didn't get sent to Egypt in slavery had to eat as well. So his brothers come to Egypt, and they don't recognize him. And they ask for grain, and he recognizes them immediately. And you can go through and read it all. But long story short, he arranges for his father and his younger brother all to come, and then he reveals himself to him that I'm your brother, And he convinces Pharaoh to let them settle in the land of Goshen because they were shepherds and they were distasteful to the Egyptians. Well, the land of Goshen was fertile. It was good for herding and it was good for planting. And so they were going to be in a land of plenty in a time of famine. And that's how God uses Joseph in famine to bring all 70 people of the house of Jacob, plus women and kids, into the land of Goshen. And that's where they will be oppressed for 400 years. And Genesis 15:13 will be fulfilled. And so you have, I'm not going to cover all the food for thoughts as we go through. They're just there as you read. But interestingly enough, as you go through Jacob and Esau, if you remember that story, Esau gave up his birthright for some red stew. I don't know if it was vegetable soup or what the red stew was, but he gave it up.
Borscht.
It was borscht, obviously. I think it even said, I think that's the Hebrew word for it.
Or goulash.
The goulash. And then the idea that Joseph is imprisoned with a baker and the cupbearer, wine and bread. And the bread was broken. The baker was killed. Is amazing. A lot of symbolism there. And so, we're going way too fast. There we go. Okay. So that brings us to Exodus. So we've taken from Abraham, where God has come to him and covenanted with him and said, you will be my people, but you're not going to experience the promise in the land of milk and honey that I'm going to give you. In actuality, your descendants are going to inherit that land, but not before I bring them into a land that's not their own and they're oppressed. And so they're moved into the land of Egypt. They're in the land of Goshen. And we start off the book of names, which is Exodus. The way it would have been in the Torah, they would have called it the book of names. So we start off in Exodus that there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. So the time had passed, and they no longer knew this patriarch, Joseph, who had protected Egypt and been the second most powerful man in Egypt. And the current Pharaoh was getting pretty nervous because these Israelites, these people of the house of Jacob were multiplying and they were growing. And then he says, let us oppress them so that they don't become mightier than us. And when we are attacked by our enemies, that they would join with them and overtake us. And so he starts doing various things. He starts having them be slaves and build a storehouse of Pithom Ramses. He has them, the midwives seek to kill the firstborn. And that's where we have the story of Moses, who actually not only doesn't get killed by the midwives, but gets adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter and grows up in the kingdom as a favored son. It's amazing. You're supposed to be killed. You're supposed to, drowned in the river. And instead of that, God protects you and brings you into the very kingdom that you are going to speak to and bring your people out. And so as we get to Exodus 11, a lot has transpired. Moses and Aaron have been called on Sinai. They have gone to Pharaoh and they've told him time and time again, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, let my people go. Oh, let my people go, right? That's exactly how they did it, right? And then they walked like an Egyptian. Which was not a cultural faux pas at all. As soon as you walked into Egypt, you had to start doing that. It was required, or Pharaoh would make you build bricks. And so God started bringing plagues in. If you remember the plagues.
I think it's important to note that Steve Martin did one of the most important bits of Egyptian history when he did the King Tut did on Saturday Night Live, so everybody needs to watch that.
Yeah, I think we should just pause now and watch that episode. King Tut. Too much fun. So we've gone through flies and locusts and the Nile turning to blood and the gnats and frogs and darkness and the famine of the land and of the meat. And now we've gone through 9 plagues and we're coming up to the 10th plague, where God has said, I'm going to treat you like you've treated me. So I'm going to kill the firstborn. You killed all of our firstborn, our children, our boys. And now there's going to be a plague in the land that's going to take away the firstborn. Now, interestingly enough, history reveals and our records reveal that actually this occurred. The firstborn in Egypt actually did die. And we know that because the person who succeeded the Pharaoh was not his firstborn. It was his second-born child that succeeded him. So the succession, right around this time, did not go to the firstborn. Interesting little fact of history, how history confirms, how archaeology has confirmed that this plague actually happened. And so we're going to take a moment here, if you have your Bibles with you, and in your table groups, just take a quick moment and read over Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 17 in your table groups.
Well,
Go ahead.
so.
Are you going to share?
We felt like for the Passover, one of the, maybe God institutionalized Passover because that's where they had to eat it quickly. And so Kay's thought on that was it's sustenance for the journey because they had to get out of town,
Yeah.
but they had to eat quickly and they were given specific instructions on how that was to be done. But it was still a remembrance kind of thing, but okay, this is sustenance, so we're going to leave. Feast of Unleavened Bread, again, a memorial. It's always the remembrance part of what God has done for his people. So, I mean, in essence, that's what we boiled it down to, sustenance and remembrance.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what Kay's saying.
That's good.
Are Ken and Diane saying?
We're in agreement, right?
Okay, great.
We're in agreement.
All right, we have consensus at the Morton and Gilliland table. What about Paul and Lori? What did you guys come up with?
What you showed me in verse 26 summed it up, and that's kind of what Kate was saying
Yeah.
as far as the children. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you, then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when we struck down the Egyptians.
Memorial or remembrance.
Memorial. Mhm.
Absolutely. But, yeah.
I know we discussed that they had to, be ready to flee. They had,
Mhm.
but the first thing that they said is, and maybe I'm reading more into it than it is, but it says that they have to eat with their belts fastened. So is that just practicality of needing to leave and you're ready to go, or did he not want them to overindulge in eating? Because
Oh, good one, Lori.
like provision, like
Yeah.
don't overstuff yourself, and or was it just have your garments on and be ready to go?
Yeah. I never thought about
funny.
that. That's pretty good. Yeah. That's
Nice.
good. Put your girdle on, that way you don't have to unbutton the top button. Yeah, that's good.
I couldn't wear their stretchy pants.
Yeah, they couldn't wear their stretchy
Put your
pants.
Spanx on.
Diane did say that maybe this is where, fast food originated.
Ah, the feast of fast food.
The
Yeah.
feast of fast food, yeah.
Gotta be on the go, so,
That's right. One of the things that we talked about back there was actually they were eating it with haste and leaving none of it behind, but they didn't have to leave right then because it was going to pass over. So
Yeah.
you're going to read next that you're going to see the plague happen. And it's not going to be until later that they're going to be pushed out of the land of Goshen. But it was like having your loins girded, which means what would happen is you raise your tunic up and be ready to run, fleet feet, if you will. And then what you're going to see is as soon as they get into the land, the wilderness, they're going to start complaining about all the good meat they had in Egypt. Didn't our pots overrun with meat? Didn't we have food? Are there no graves in Egypt that you bring us to the wilderness to die? And you start to see that semblance of, but didn't they just kill the lamb without blemish and eat and feast well? just to be able to complain about it in the wilderness. It's fascinating. How about this table?
We didn't have a single original thought at all. Most of us were incredibly disappointed in Gary.
Well, I think we should just pause right now and talk about our disappointments. We have a Festivus.
That's a whole other class. That's a whole other 4-hour
You can
conference.
Everybody just pick one person and talk about how disappointed you are.
He thought it was similar to the holiday of Festivus.
Yes. Oh wow.
It struck me how the Lord, used food, used something practical. It was a spiritual remembrance that they would carry on for generations to follow. But He used something very tangible like food, and how I think it's reflective of the way He created us as spirit beings. We're also physical beings, so there's a sensory element to even worship, and so that was something we talked about.
That's awesome.
We saw the idea of remembrance, and of course we fast forwarded to the New Testament and the words of Jesus to do this in remembrance of me.
Yes.
Mhm.
So
The two elements.
yeah, the wine and the bread. So why is it that God chooses food in Genesis, good and pleasant, as a sense of obedience, and then as we're just in Exodus, second book of the Torah, second book of the Old Testament, now we're having food to memorialize things, and then as you guys did, you jumped into the New Testament, and Jesus is going to institute the Passover as communion, as He's leaving.
Right.
What's the significance of that? And I don't know that we all have good answers on that. And it's just something to ponder. Like, why at almost every significant moment is there some institution of food or memorial that involves a specific thing you have to do around food?
Food is an essential.
Food is essential. Yeah.
They didn't have Trader Joe's, and food, as often you see in Europe still, was a day-to-day experience, as you recognized in Liberia.
Yeah.
We take food for granted.
Right.
It's just, no one gives it serious thought, unless it's a lousy meal. Whereas throughout Scripture, and in much of the world still, food is directly linked to survival.
Right.
We don't make that connection. We know we have to eat, but we know it's not a real issue. We can get it anytime we want.
Right.
That's not true in Liberia.
Sure
It wasn't true in the Old Testament.
Yeah. I find it easy to give no thought of what I will eat tomorrow.
Right.
In America.
Yeah, yeah.
In Liberia, it was a little bit different. And the idea of faith, and you start thinking about, Jesus at the well and drawing the water, or going through the fields and plucking the grain, or being out in the wilderness and complaining, and then manna falls from heaven. We start to see this idea of God is good, God is great. Let us thank Him for our food, because by His hands we all are fed. Give us, Lord, our daily bread. And I think we often have the luxury to not even think about our daily bread in America, and to not think about how God is good and has, in His sovereignty, put us here that we wouldn't have to think about our daily bread for tomorrow. And it's not, at least in my experience, me personally, it's not because I have so much faith in America that I don't worry about food. It's that I have faith that I have dollars in my bank account, that I have a McDonald's next door, that there's a supermarket within a mile of me, that, as Tim Chester will say, we can spend more money on dieting than giving money and food to the poor. We have, in some ways, idolized food, in other ways, idolized ourselves, and we've mistaken the idea of the sovereignty of God for the sovereignty of ourselves. And so we don't have to have faith that our food's going to be here. And I don't, there are supermarkets in Liberia, and they have guards outside them and stuff. But the interesting thing is like in Liberia, you catch a fish, you get some rice, you put it in your dog bowl, you eat it. And then the people that travel there can go into the stores, and they have guards outside the stores. So there's a guard at the door, then they go through that door, there's another guard, because they're food insecure. If they didn't have guards, the people would go take the food. Now, the Liberian people were very honest and people of integrity, so they're not prone to steal and things of that nature. But it's the idea of there's this whole supermarket of food for people coming in, and people over here in shanties eating a piece of cornbread or a piece of rice or a head of a fish. And so, yeah.
I think I was just sitting here thinking, and this is convicting to me personally, it's not me preaching to the evildoers. It takes more discipline to be grateful when we have plenty.
Yeah.
And I mean, God acknowledges that and warns against it all throughout Scripture. I mean, beginning with when He ultimately takes them in the Promised Land, He says, basically when you enter in, don't forget that I brought you here.
Yeah.
Choose life. If you go in and you forget about me, it's basically going to be a curse upon you. If you go in and you continually remember me, it's going to be a blessing.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that in the sense of, like what you said, Gordon said, nobody really gives much thought to food unless it's a bad meal.
Right.
It's like, I was thinking, we struggle to acknowledge the plenty when something's always there.
Yeah.
And be grateful for it. And we only acknowledge. It's like I've often said in church ministry, and no commentary on any of y'all that are back there serving, but it's like how often, how many places in certain countries would just love to have a sound system to be able to amplify sound and music in a worship service, and yet the only time that we in our services think of the AV team is when something's off.
Yeah.
How many people think that every week give thanks, God, thank you for these speakers that we can have this worship service. Thank you for the people back there serving, but if a mic goes wrong or a speaker shuts down, it's like everybody turns around to acknowledge it. And it's sort of that way with my heart with food.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I've never gone hungry. I've had meals I don't like.
Sure.
And Thanksgiving, I mean daily. I'm not even talking about yours.
I know.
But thanks.
I don't think I'd have said that.
But not just
Getting good. Let it go.
not just the holiday of Thanksgiving, but daily Thanksgiving or truly giving thanks at meals just becomes perfunctory.
Yeah.
I look at how tough it is to get our kids to realize we're talking to God here and we're literally grateful for this meal
Right.
and for this time together. But if we could only eat what we grew and only eat what we killed, that would be a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Like yesterday we were running late, and this is no comment on Meredith because she plans way ahead, and thank God for that because I plan way behind. But like yesterday, we hadn't planned what we were going to eat day before, and typically it's all planned and laid out, and Meredith's got a schedule, but she's been sick and been running behind. Well, it's really not a stressor. It feels like a little bit of a stressor. It's like, I don't know what we're going to eat tonight. Well, where could we stop? We're passing 100 places on the way home where we can get an affordable meal.
Right.
But what if we had no food? So these are things I'm just processing because I realize how ungrateful I am
Yeah.
and how little food means to me.
Well, two thoughts come to my mind. First of all, to whom is given, much will be required. And we have been given so much.
Haven't we?
Now, I think, in our day and age, none of us ever really did go without, per se. There was the Great Depression in this country. Perhaps those people began to think of provision a little differently.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how that was ever really passed on to us, per se, but isn't any wonder that God had to provide something, some events, as remembrances, because we all so quickly forget.
Yes.
So generation after generation, do I expect my grandchildren to know any want? No, they've never had to. So I just think God in His mercy provides us with some special remembrances. And do we need to be really thoughtful of prayer at meal? Yeah, all of us, because we all become kind of rote in our Thanksgiving
Don't we?
and all of that.
Mhm.
You know, so yeah, I don't know what I'm saying all that other than yes, we need to remember.
Mhm.
Well, what do you guys think that we typically memorialize our own holidays with food? So think about Thanksgiving and how it was memorialized with food, how Christmas has food, Easter has food, Valentine's Day, you take your sweetheart out for a meal and you better hope it's good. You know, why we do that today? What is it about food that when we get together, we have food? Do you even think about it, or is it just something you do, something ingrained in you? What would happen if this, coming up next week on Thursday, you went and celebrated Thanksgiving, but with no food,
Or with something different
or with something different?
besides turkey days and dressing.
Now, we had the privilege of celebrating Thanksgiving in Liberia. So Liberia was settled by American slaves, or Congo people, and they brought a lot of the Western traditions into Liberia. It was the only country that was not a slave colony, but it was founded by slaves. So the Congo people came in and set up what they call Little America. So their flag was like the American flag with one star and some of those things. But one of the things they brought over was Thanksgiving. And their Thanksgiving is on Thursday, the first Thursday of November. And so we got to be there for Thanksgiving. And so we were asking our driver, Elijah, and his brother, Jerry, what do you do for Thanksgiving? Do you have special foods and things like that? And he looked at us like we were kind of crazy. You know, we don't have special food for Thanksgiving. We just we sometimes take the day off. We might work. But we stayed at the Tropicana Beach Resort, which compared to Liberia was like the Ritz-Carlton. We had our own little cabana, one-room cabana with a bathroom and a little kitchenette. But we were right on the beach. Beautiful, beautiful place. You almost forget you're in West Africa and there's no food. But what they did is they came to the beach. And so you saw a lot of festivities on the beach. But it wasn't around a meal. Because they see food differently there. It's just kind of interesting. And if you didn't feed them, they didn't eat. So like one of the things we recognized, like Elijah was my driver for Hannah and I, and he would go with us. But unless you invited him into the restaurant, he wouldn't come in. And unless you invited him to sit at your table, he wouldn't sit there. And unless you invited him to order something, he wouldn't order. And so you had to prod them towards food at every step. And then when they got the food, they'd never eat it. Well, I guess Elijah ate Sunday lunch with us. But when they ordered the food, they would always get it to go. And we'd say, "You're not going to eat now?" "No, I'll take it home to my family." And you're like,
Wow.
well, I would just eat what I wanted and gave them the leftovers. But they would always get it in a box, and they would always go home and share it with their family. Just an amazing, different way of looking at things. And as we talk about what Gary said, he's talking about when you come into the land of milk and honey that I've given you, be careful to remember that it's the Lord your God that brought you into the land. Because when you do that, I will bless you. But if you forget, and if you turn, then these will be your curses. And it's not much later in Exodus that we're going to see Jesus bring them out, God bring them out. And he's going to part the Red Sea, they're going to be on the other side, they're going to sing the Song of Moses. Then, right after they sing the Song of Moses, the elders and Moses are going to go up on the Mount Sinai. They're going to have a meal with God. Then, right after that, they're going to covenant. They're saying, whatever God says, we're going to do. And after they do that, Moses is going to go up on the mountain, and he's going to receive the Ten Commandments. And while he's doing that, the people of Israel are going to make they're going to make a molten calf, a golden calf, and say, and Aaron's going to hold it up and say, "Children of Israel, these are the gods that brought you out." So one of the reasons I believe that we have to have a Passover memorial, we have to have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is because it was only 20 chapters later they're making a molten calf to worship.
Right.
When they just saw the pillar and the cloud bring them through, how easily we forget, once we've been delivered, the deliverer, the one who has provided.
The same people, not even the next generation.
Right.
Yeah.
Now granted, there was 2.5 million of them, so maybe they didn't get the memo. But we joked about, I joked about this a couple weekends ago. When you get to Exodus 20 and you're in the Song of Moses, and it talks about how Miriam is singing the song and they're going through, and she's going through the people. Like, how long does it take to get to 2.5 million people to sing the Song of Moses? Did she pass out, like, she made copies for 2.5 million people? Like,
PowerPoint,
PowerPoint, it was probably PowerPoint.
tablet point.
But so easily we forget when we're in the land of plenty, our provision comes from God. And that whatever we have, good or bad, nothing comes through to us except it passes through the hand of God first. And so there is a great opportunity to do what I call resting our head on the comfortable pillow of the sovereignty of God.
Just one thought. This is highlighting for me personally, again, the importance of fasting, and that basically the spiritual discipline of fasting is it is a personal discipline to put myself in a posture to stir gratitude and to respond to a season of hunger with hunger for God.
Yeah.
Like John Piper wrote a book called Hunger for God, and he said in there that his discipline when he fasts is that whenever his stomach growls during ceasing from food, whenever his stomach growls, he turns that into a prayer. And he says, Lord, I want to hunger for you. And just, fasting becomes like a joke for us. I mean, I hear more jokes about fasting than I do hear of people fasting in our culture.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh yeah, fasting, it's not for me. But I think if Jesus taught fasting and he practiced fasting and he assumed fasting because he says when you fast, in a culture like that, where there wasn't that level of abundance, especially for common folk, and I'm just processing for me right now how much more important fasting actually is in a place where I can go and never know want.
Right.
How much more, and that's an act of remembrance.
It is.
Like, okay, God, you are my source, not my hands, not Chick-fil-A, not.
Yeah, and if you guys want it, there's some copies of it. David Beatty from River Oaks just finished a book on fasting, and different ways of fasting and all the components of that. So if you guys want a copy of that, let me know and I'll pick some up and bring it to you. But it just, the idea of obedience to God, going back to Genesis, in our food. So how do we, when the Pharisees are going to come to Jesus and they're going to say, okay, look, our disciples fast, the disciples of John fast, but your disciples do not fast. Why is that? He doesn't say, well, because it's a new kingdom and we don't have to fast anymore. He says, my disciples don't fast because you don't fast when the bridegroom is with you. But after I leave, then they will fast. And it's another idea that the disciples, our bridegroom is on his way back, right? And until then, through obedience to God, one of the ways we show that is by limiting our food because we are trusting Him to provide, that we can skip a meal. So in our culture it's a little bit different, but in the ancient Near East, skipping a meal, you've had 2 meals a day, so to leave 1 meal behind is a big deal. And we talk about the widow and Elijah and the barrel that never runs dry and the provision of God, all the way through to the New Testament, which is where we're going now with the third course, with the book of Luke. And so we're going to see in the book of Luke, John the Baptist if you know, John is the forerunner, right? He's the one that says in Isaiah that there will be one that comes before me, saying, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight your paths. That's John the Baptist. And Elizabeth is told that John would be one who would not eat, would not drink of the vine, and he would eat weird foods like locusts and wild honey, right? And so his food would be different. He'd be set apart in his eating and his drinking. But we're going to read in Luke 7 that Jesus came eating and drinking, and they called John a crazy man. They called Jesus a glutton and a drunkard. Now, I don't know how many of you are pre-Baptist. In the past, you were worried about alcohol and things of that nature. And there's a lot of discussion sometimes around, did Jesus actually drink wine? Fermented drink. Did Jesus drink that? Well, we have pretty strong evidence that it wasn't the drinking of wine that was the problem. It was the drunkenness of the wine. So drink, but don't be drunk kind of thing. So yes, we believe that Jesus partook of wine because it would have been customary at meals to do that. We see Paul telling Timothy, hey man, you got a stomach ulcer. You know, church planting is hard. Drink a little wine. You know, he was with the Cretans, so we're not quite at the Cretan level. I mean, we have Gordon. He's Hungarian. It's close enough.
Close as you can get here.
So we start to see this idea that they saw Jesus a little bit differently. They saw his disciples differently. And then that brings us to the book of Luke. And like I said earlier, Jesus in the book of Luke is either going to, coming from, or at a meal. And in the going to and coming from the meals, he's often doing something with food. They're walking through a field, plucking grain, and things of that nature. And so in the 24 books, if you just look at what's on the screen there, you can see 4, 5, 6, 10, 11, 14, 15, 16, 19, 22, and 24 all have either a reference about food or a specific meal and teaching of God. So, for example, the first temptation of Jesus. Okay? What do you guys remember how Satan tempted Jesus when he was in the wilderness for 40 days? What was the first thing he did?
Turn the rocks into bread.
Turn the rocks into bread. And what was the response to that?
Man shall not live on bread alone.
That's right. About every word that comes out of the mouth of God. And then in chapter 5, we're talking about the story of fasting. What we just talked about. Why is it that your disciples don't fast? And then they're harvesting grain on the Sabbath in the 6th chapter, right? No, they're just walking through and eating a few heads of grain because they're hungry on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees call them out and saying, you're doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And then in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is going to say back to them, he's going to say, do you not know what David and his men did when they had hunger? How they went into the temple and they eat the showbread, which was not lawful, but for the priest. I tell you, man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. And this idea that we can rest in the provision of God. Then we fast forward to chapter 10 and the mission of the 70. Take no provision. Don't take 2 coats. Don't take food with you. But in the city that you go in, enter the house and eat what they provide to you. I can tell you that that passage in Luke I recited over and over while I was in Liberia. It has several pieces to it. One of them is when you go, whoever welcomes you, put your peace upon that place. Eat what they provide you. And on the way, greet no one on the street. So I'm a Southerner. So everyone I go by on the street, it's a head nod, right? How you doing? Because that's how we do things here. That's not how they do things in Liberia. If you give someone a head nod or you say hello in Liberia, okay, we're engaging in conversation now. You want to help me. You want to give me money, American. You want to buy something from me. Come to my shop. So you engage no one on the street. Couple of rules in Liberia is that you never went anywhere after dark. You never went anywhere without your driver. You never went anywhere alone. Not even in the compound we were in. So we had walls that we couldn't go past. So when we were out on the beach, when you got to that part, there was a security guard, you turned around. And, you know, it's a very hot climate, so everyone's outside. And, you know, because they have no running water, no electricity, or they call it current. They have no current, no running water, and they have like a one-room concrete building. And so they would be outside a lot, so it's very crowded. And it took me a long time to even be comfortable getting out of the car because I was an anomaly. People would immediately notice you. So we rode in cars with blacked out windows and things like that. Peace was hard to come by. And so one of the things we prayed for is how do we have peace on this car, peace on this place that we're in, but also how do we eat the food that they provided us as they've welcomed us here. So that's actually one that stuck in my head for 2 weeks. And then we have the Lord's Prayer in chapter 11. Give us, Lord, our daily bread. But around that daily bread we have forgiveness and removal of temptations and the exaltation of God to begin with. And of course we've talked about Luke 15 and the parable of the lost son and the elder brother. And this, you know, what happens when someone receives the kingdom, how God rejoices and throws a party and kills the fatted calf. And then the rich man and Lazarus. And as you just can imagine, can you just give me one drop of water? Just one. But then there's more significant components to the meals in Luke. And maybe there are. It will turn. And so we start to see, and I know Gary has preached on some of these already in our series, but we start to see some more significant meals. And I don't know if you've ever taken the time to walk through the meals and see what was being taught, who was there, who was seeing those. And so in Luke chapter 5, 27 through 39, it's the banquet at Levi's house. Levi was a tax collector. He was a traitor. He was the outcast of society. I don't know what would you guys equate that to today? What is the most detestable person that you could think of? Not name, but just type of person. So like here, the type of person is tax collector. What would that be?
Has it changed?
Yes, tax collector. Yes. All right. I was going to say,
I'm wondering what would it be, because I'm a tax preparer. What's it like to be the IRS agent? I'm wondering about that. Like,
yeah.
How does that feel?
IRS agent. I like that. I was going to say judge, but I'm kidding.
Politician.
Politician.
Yeah, I would say especially in our current climate, and specifically a politician of a party that I'm opposed to.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
people get raked across the coals for even being seen with somebody that we think they should disagree with because I detest them.
Right. All right. I want you guys to take a moment and just envision. We're going to have a meal. It's going to be in the middle of Benton Convention Center, and we're going to invite all the people that want to come. And we're going to sit there and we're going to have a meal with the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. We're going to invite him to the table and we're going to eat with him. How do you think people would, they would see him as an outcast, as a traitor, as the lowest of low society? Or, unfortunately, some people, if we invited Trump to a meal, they might say the same thing. Or what about Adolf Hitler? If we lived in a time where he was still alive, or the Indians were right and were reincarnated and we had him there in his stingray format, because I think he was a stingray when he was, anyway, I watched Moana last night. The grandmother turns to a stingray.
Oh.
But just think about who would be at your table and who you would be ashamed to be eating with. If you had to invite anybody who wanted to come, and you had to sit beside them, and not only sit beside them, but break bread with them, eat with them, discuss with them. And not only that, but they get to bring all of their outcast friends. So in the house of Levi, it wasn't just Levi and Jesus having a meal, it was all of the other tax collector friends. Because you had to hang out in a group, that was all you had, right? What would that be like for you? Could you do it?
No.
Yeah.
you'd have to be pretty confident in yourself, what you believe in, sure.
Sure. What would you say to people who said, why are you eating with those people?
Because Eric told me to.
Yeah. Sounds like my children. So the kiddos, for whatever reason, chief is a word that they use a lot in Liberia. And so my kids from Liberia say to me when I tell them something, yes, sir, chief. And Gordon, I was going to ask if you would do that as well. But it's the idea that Jesus is using this meal to evangelize. And then what does he tell them whenever they ask him why he's eating with people like this? I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. The call to us is to reach out in our circles to the outcast, to the downtrodden, to the traitor, to show them the mercy and grace of Jesus, that they may too come to repentance. And that's not easy. It's one, for me, it's hard to even figure out if I know any outcasts or traitors. It's hard for me to figure out, well, who in society that is the lowest of the low that I actually know? And I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I keep the holy huddle, stay within that. And we don't live downtown. We don't see that very often. Taking time to befriend someone who's outcast, I don't think I've ever done that. And I start to look at this and I'm like, well, there's another place to repent, another way to figure out how I'm using my life of plenty to reach people for the gospel. Rather than thinking, I'm not safe here. I don't know what you're going to think if I eat with these people. I don't know what, is it going to get on me? Am I going to get something? Am I going to get a disease? So, Jesus just says, let's go eat. And I know he's the God, and one of the things I often say when people say, what would Jesus do? Is, well, he's the God of the universe. He has unlimited resources. He knows what's going to happen. He's not got any fear about doing anything. But then at the end of the day, when you start reading through the Gospels, you see that he did have some misgivings about people. He wouldn't trust them because he knew that every heart of the man of evil. When he prayed in the garden, he started drops of great blood. So there was things in him that knew what these people were about, and that's why he specifically reached out to them. And that brings us to chapter 7. Now we move from the sinner, the tax collector, in chapter 5. And just a few chapters later, in 7, we're going to be at Simon the Pharisee's house. And Pharisees get a bad rap, right? So they get this idea that they're holier than thou. But what they were trying to do, they were trying to hold on to the idea of what holiness was like. And they went a little bit too far. They got a little bit overzealous to the point where Jesus will tell them, you make your traditions of man over what God has commanded you to do. And so he goes not only to eat with the tax collector, now he's eating with the Pharisees. And here, what Tim Chester uses in his book is the idea that you're at a big social gathering with politicians, maybe the president's there, and a prostitute comes in. And you can tell she's a prostitute by the way she's dressed. And she comes into the leader, the politician, and gives him a hug and then starts talking to him. And the politician, she acts like she knows him. And everybody begins to think like, well, how does he know her? Because we know she's a prostitute. Well, in this story, the lady comes in. And because, again, they're going to have the windows and doors open in the Pharisee's home. They're going to be preparing the meal. And the poor are going to be outside of this, watching the meal. So she would have had access. It wasn't like she had to come knock on the door and she barged in through security. She would have been able to come in pretty freely. And not only come in pretty freely, she was able to then reach Jesus, and he didn't recoil and jump back and say, be away, woman. He embraced her. He allowed her to wash his feet. And then not only that, he rebukes Simon for not doing what was customary of giving him water for his feet, greeting him with a kiss. And he says to him, since this woman has come in, she has not stopped to wash her feet or stopped kissing my feet. But you gave me no water for my feet or no kiss of greeting when I came in. And then he equates himself with God and he forgives the woman's sin in the Pharisee's home. Blasphemy. The Pharisee would have immediately known. And not only that, he doesn't forgive the Pharisee. He rebukes him, but there's no forgiveness. And what we start to see is a theme that God, Jesus, is walking through repentance with the outcast and calling the Pharisee, the holier-than-thou person, to repentance. All the way through till we get to Luke 15, that he says, if you don't, then they're going to be in the kingdom and you're not. And then we're going to see the great banquet, and not this sermon, but the next sermon, where he's going to say, if you're too busy, if you've got too much going on, if your marriage is too important, if you've just bought an ox, if you've just got this, and you don't come, we'll go into the highways and the hedges, and we will compel them to come in. And those were the people who will be at the great banquet. So let's take a quick 10-minute break here, and we'll continue with chapter 9 with the breaking of bread with the 5,000 served.